Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today, we've got this great stack of sources you sent in, articles, notes, research, and we're going to do a really fascinating deep dive into the history of Chile. It's complex, but really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And our mission basically is to pull out those key insights, the really important bits of knowledge.
Sort of a shortcut, right?
Yeah.
To get you up to speed on a nation that's just so shaped by its unique geography and its really tumultuous past.
Exactly. Tumultuous is a good word for it. We'll try and cover the whole sweep, ancient origins, those incredible landscapes.
Colonization, the fight for independence.
Those periods of political turmoil, which were intense right up to the more recent economic and social stuff.
It's a big story. Okay, let's get started unpacking it.
Absolutely. And you really have to start with the geography, the land itself.
Chile's shape is just so distinctive, isn't it? That long, narrow strip.
The longest and narrowest country in the world, yeah. Squeezed between the Pacific on one side and the huge wall of the Andes on the other.
And the Atacama Desert up north. The sources mention the coastline over 4,600 kilometers. Huge.
Massive coastline. But the land area itself, around 800,000 square kilometers, isn't as vast as you might think for that length.
That shape must just dominate everything.
It really does. It's not just a map feature. It shapes history, culture, everything, and the natural beauty.
Well, one of your sources even calls Chile the most stellar nation.
Stellar, what does that mean?
It mentions the crystallized skies, the transparent water. Very poetic language.
It does capture that diversity, though. You go from the Atacama, the hottest desert,
down to glaciers in Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego in the south. Total extremes.
Plus the Andes peaks, the central region, the rainy coasts. You can see forests, beaches, vineyards, cities, all pretty close together.
It's incredibly varied, and this land was home to people very early on.
Right. The sources mention Paleo-Indians arriving maybe 12,500 years ago.
Yeah.
From North America.
That's the evidence, yeah. Though there might have been a bigger South American migration even earlier, like 15,000 years ago. So who are the first groups specifically in what's now Chile?
The earliest evidence points to Pulcha speakers maybe 7,500 years ago. Hunters, gatherers on the flatlands.
And they had dogs.
Rudimentary dog husbandry, yeah. One of those small details that paints a picture.
Then came another wave.
A big one. The Aymara, around 5,000 years ago. They came down from the Lake Titicaca area.
And they brought more complex stuff.
Yeah, agriculture, llamas, altacas, metallurgy, complex ceremonies. They settled mostly in the north and central parts.
Were other groups developing elsewhere at the same time?
Oh, yes. The sources talk about food-producing settlements popping up in the central and south about 3,200 years ago.
Doing different things.
Kind of specialized. You had hunters in the mountains, fishers on the coast, forest hunters, farmers in the lowlands using irrigation for tubers, pumpkins, legumes.
But maybe not as complex technologically as the northern groups.
The sources suggest their technology varied, yeah. Maybe less centralized than what developed in the north.
So agriculture develops independently, but leads to different kinds of societies.
Exactly. In the north, with that Aymara influence, you see the rise of chiefdoms, even sort of theocratic states with monuments, surplus for elites and temples.
And in the south.
Different structures. They built these pyramid-shaped burials, which suggests hierarchy, but maybe not states in the same way. Different paths.
And it's important to remember, cultures like the Mapuche and Aymara are still around.
Absolutely vital. They didn't vanish. They've persisted and are a huge part of Chile's dynamic culture today. Folklore, farming, crafts, art, music, dance, deep roots.
Okay, so that sets the scene. The land, the early people, then the Spanish arrive. Big shift.
Huge shift. Spain in the 15th century is just off the Reconquista looking for empire, gold, silver, converts, all of that.
Diego de Almagro tries first, 1536. Doesn't go so well.
He meets hostile resistance, turns back, didn't find the easy riches he hoped for.
But then Pedro de Valdivia comes in 1541, more determined.
Much more. He's got a settlement project, found Santiago. His early reports sound quite positive.
What did he say he found?
Things like gold washings, good land, Mediterranean climate, and numerous natives easy to discipline. That phrase stands out.
Easy to discipline. Yeah, that sounds like it's going to be a problem.
Uh-huh. Because the people who resisted Almagro, particularly the Mapuche, were still there, and they were not easy to discipline.
They put up serious resistance.
A fierce resistance. So fierce that Valdivia himself dies fighting them in 1554.
Wow. The leader of the expedition killed? That's major.
A huge blow. And it wasn't just him. The sources talk about a massive Mapuche counteroffensive in 1598.
What happened then?
It basically defeated the Spanish advance south. They had to pull back the frontier to the Biobío River. The dream of controlling the whole territory ended there.
And another governor died too.
A second governor, yeah, died in what the Spanish called the rebellion. It shows how tough that resistance was.
So the 1600s weren't smooth sailing for the Spanish. More like a stalemate.
Pretty much. It became a military frontier zone. Forts, soldiers, who often had to be paid from Lima because the sources say the Chilean economy couldn't even afford this permanent war.
And those encounters between Spanish and indigenous people, the sources use some pretty stark language.
They do. Talk about initial friendly meetings turning violent. Phrases like lustful Spanish, humble and astonished natives, the sword and cross used against unarmed leaders.
And the indigenous perspective.
The sources try to capture that too, seeing Spanish ethics as incomprehensible, calling them false priests, blood-stained, fork-tongued emperors. It really highlights the clash of worlds and fuels that 70 years of fierce resistance mentioned.
Let's focus on Santiago's founding. That was key.
Absolutely. February 12, 1541, meant to be the capital, built on Picunchi land. They called it Joaquina.
Valdivia named it Santiago del Nuevo Extremo, after St. James.
Right. And the location near the Mapuche River and the Andes foothills, that was strategic for defense.
Defense against the indigenous groups further south.
Exactly. And laid out in that classic rectangular grid, like other colonial cities.
But that location was tested almost right away.
Almost immediately. Just 10 months in, Mapuche forces under Michimalonco attacked.
What happened?
They burned the city, it fell, the settlers fled. Chaos. But Valdivia managed to rally the defenders.
And they retook it.
After a week of what the sources call furious battle, yes, they scattered the Mapuche forces, reestablished control. A very close call.
But Santiago survived and started to grow.
It did. They focused on churches, cathedrals, building up trade with the port, Valparaiso. By the 1580s, maybe 2,000 people, it became the colonial center.
And this whole colonial setup with all its built-in tensions eventually leads towards independence, right?
Exactly. Just like elsewhere in Latin America in the early 19th century, by 1810, Chile's population wasn't huge, maybe 200,000 people.
And conditions weren't great for many.
No, the sources stress widespread misery. They give figures like out of 120,000 workers, maybe 80,000 were desperately poor. Half of Santiago's population called working poor. So yeah, fertile ground for change.
What were the sparks?
Well, internal colonial conflicts were peaking around 1810. External factors too, communication with the West Indies, maybe some quiet British support.
Britain was often happy to see Spain weakened.
Right. But a key internal thing was the rise of local elites. Traders, landowners, mine owners, they were getting wealthier, wanting more power, more autonomy.
And this led to action in Santiago.
It did. April 1810, inspired by what was happening in Argentina, people in Santiago rose up against the Spanish viceroy.
The first real steps towards independence.
Yeah, leading to what's called a cabildo abierto.
A cabildo abierto. Remind us what that is.
It's like an open town council meeting, an emergency thing under Spanish law, where prominent citizens could gather and make decisions, bypassing the normal authorities, crucial for those first moves.
And the idea of independence itself wasn't clear-cut at first.
No, that's interesting. Initially, it was more about separating from the royal authority if the king in Spain was compromised, like by Napoleon. Not necessarily full separation forever.
But the idea evolved.
Quickly, yeah, into the bigger idea of American independence. But the sources say there were debates right from the start within that assembly. How far should we go?
Someone even proposed full independence early on, but it got rejected.
That's right. Shows it wasn't a simple unified decision. They postponed it.
Looking back, that founding of Santiago really did set the stage for conflict, didn't it?
Absolutely. The society that grew out of it was based on European conquest, suppressing the existing civilizations. The sources emphasize that. So the independence movement, while fighting Spain, still inherited that complex, unequal structure.
The movement needed leaders. Who were the key figures?
Your sources point out several. José Miguel Carrera is one. Wealthy family, Spanish background, became a leader after 1810, pushed for reforms, and was one of the first to really argue for Chile being fully independent.
And Manuel Rodriguez Erdoiza. He sounds like a character.
A real folk hero type. Commander after Carrera, popular with ordinary people, totally committed to a republic, master of disguise and guerrilla tactics, always on the run, eventually caught and killed by royalist forces.
Then Bernardo O'Higgins, probably the most famous name.
Hugely important. Son of a former Spanish governor, ironically, led armies in the north, became wanted, got help from San Martin.
Jose de San Martin, the Argentine general.
Exactly. O'Higgins eventually came back to lead, became the first head of state, the director supremo.
And San Martin's role was critical, too.
Absolutely decisive. His army crossing the Andes, the victory at the Battle of Chacabuco in 1817, that's what really allowed the first proper Republican government to get established in Chile. Your sources are clear on that.
Okay, so independence is one. The 19th century begins this period of big transformation.
Massive changes. The sources describe Chile becoming much more like a modern state by the late 1800s. Politics, economy, society, all getting more integrated.
Politically, a parliamentary system emerges, but with tensions.
Yeah, consolidation, but also struggles over executive power. Not always smooth. And the economy shifts dramatically, away from the old colonial model.
Towards exports, free trade.
Exactly. Commodity exports became the driver.
And the big commodity was saltpeter, nitrate.
Bingo! Hugely valuable stuff back then. For explosives, fertilizer, food preservation, massive demand. This leads directly to the War of the Pacific.
Against Peru and Bolivia, 1879 to 1884, the Saltpeter War.
That's what it was about. Control of those nitrate-rich areas.
And Chile won that war. Annexed Bolivia's coastal territory, Antofagasta.
Yes, gaining control of enormous saltpeter deposits. The sources even suggest Chilean nitrate was seen as better quality crystallized stuff. This fueled a huge economic boom.
So Chile gets rich.
The country gets richer on paper, yes.
Yeah.
But here's the catch your sources really highlight. The wealth didn't spread evenly, not by a long shot.
It went to the elites, foreign interests.
Largely, yes, what the sources call the legacy of imperialism. Meanwhile, for huge numbers of people, there was still mass poverty, illiteracy, terrible life expectancy.
They contrast Santiago with places like San Pedro de Atacama.
Yeah, stark differences in basic survival chances, right in the heart of the nitrate wealth. That kind of inequality, well, it breeds discontent.
Social tension, even violence.
Absolutely. So as Chile enters the 20th century, there are these big unanswered questions hanging in the air. Who's really running the show? Is this export boom actually making things fairer or more democratic? What's going to happen with industrialization, cities growing?
So a mix of optimism and anxiety.
Totally. This feeling of being a developed nation on one hand, but deep fears about the massive social divisions on the other. These inequalities just get more obvious in the early 20th century.
Leading to more unrest.
Fragmentation, yes, but also people organizing, protesting, challenging the system. Governments tried different things after a revolution in 1891, but that core tension between the wealthy elite and the struggling majority just kept simmering.
Which sets the stage for the really dramatic political events of the mid-20th century, leading up to Salvador Allende's election in 1970.
Allende is such a key figure. A doctor, a socialist leader for years, and then he makes history, the first Marxist elected democratically in the Western world. Huge deal.
His presidency was short, though, 1970 to 73. And intense.
Incredibly intense, polarized from the start. His goal was massive radical reforms like nationalizing copper, 90% of it, the sources say.
But trying to do it within the democratic system.
Exactly. Keep democracy intact while transforming society. But he ran into huge economic problems, massive political fights.
And the sources mention neo-colonial tensions with the U.S.
Yeah, meaning the U.S. was putting on a lot of pressure, interfering, because Allende's policies, especially nationalizing copper, hit American companies hard. This just added fuel to the fire domestically.
So the situation became more and more divided leading up to the coup.
Extremely polarized, radicalization on both sides, unrest in the streets. The sources talk about this creating an atmosphere of fear and leading to what they call an elite conformist conspiracy against him. Plus, international efforts to undermine him even before the election.
Until September 11th, 1973.
A truly traumatic date. The armed forces move in before dawn. Fighter jets bomb the presidential palace, La Moneda. Just reduce it to rubble.
The sources describe chaos and violence.
Chaotic confusion, bloody civil unrest. Allende himself died in the palace. Many of his officials, supporters met violent ends. It was brutal.
And General Augusto Pinochet takes power.
Led the coup, installed himself as president, ruled for 17 years until 1990. The sources don't mince words. They call him a fascist dictator.
His regime brought in radical economic changes.
Totally transformed the economy. Chile became, as the sources say, a kind of laboratory for radical neoliberal policies.
With help from outside?
Significant help from the U.S., international financial institutions, and implemented by Chilean economists, the famous Chicago boys.
Trained at the University of Chicago.
Many were, yes. And also influenced by this group called gremialismo.
What was gremialismo?
The kind of conservative, corporatist movement, anti-political parties, favored hierarchy, order, aligned with the military. Together, they pushed through drastic free market reforms, big trade liberalization in 74-75, slashing tariffs, getting rid of quotas.
But this came at a terrible human cost.
A horrifying cost.
Mm.
The dictatorship set up a ruthless system of repression. Thousands killed, imprisoned, exiled.
Who were the targets?
Political opponents, journalists, union leaders, activists, anyone suspected of opposition, democratic institutions dismantled, freedoms crushed, speech, press, assembly, paramilitary groups enforced the terror.
The details of the repression and the sources are chilling.
They really are. Talk of a state apparatus for capture, detention, torture, killing. Secret prisons outside Santiago. Horrific things. Police dogs, dismemberment. Bodies marked D for Desparecido disappeared. They even hunted people down internationally.
The impact must have been devastating.
Profound. Anyone involved in politics or social movements before the coup was at risk. Fleeing, prison, torture, death. It was designed to crush dissent and reshape society through fear.
Yet the memory of what happened didn't just disappear.
No, and that's powerful. The sources emphasize how truth and memories survived, even flourished, finding clandestine graves, human rights groups documenting everything, putting pressure on the elite, survivors telling their stories.
And how has public memory changed over time?
It's evolved. The sources describe a shift, maybe 40 years on, from just mourning and trying to reconcile to actively questioning and challenging the past. Memorial sites becoming places of debate, a public vivisection of the dictatorship's legacy, as one source puts it.
This intense period eventually gives way to a return to democracy.
It does. The end came via the 1988 plebiscite.
The no vote.
Exactly. A citizen movement forced the vote on whether Pinochet should continue. The no side won decisively. That kicked off a long, complex transition period, about 15 years, to restore democracy.
Did the regime have its own transition plan?
Yeah, based on the constitution they'd put in place in 1980.
Tell us about that 1980 constitution.
Complex document, lots of articles. But the sources say the language was kind of forbidding, hard for people to grasp. It talked about democracy, Christianity, individual rights, family. But it was drafted by the military junta, signed by Pinochet.
And designed to keep some control.
Definitely. The sources say it had built-in mechanisms to maintain conservatism, make it hard for traditional parties to regain full power easily. Pinochet himself was meant to stay army commander until 1993.
But the opposition managed to organize for that 1988 vote anyway?
They did, formed a coalition, the Concertation. Despite the rules being stacked against them, they planned, organized, and won that critical no vote. A huge moment.
Must have been relief, but also nervousness.
Huge relief, euphoria even. But also, the sources mention profound fear of how Pinochet's supporters, the military, might react. Would they accept it or crack down again? The transition structure itself was complicated.
Still, Chile's transition is often seen as relatively successful.
It is, generally speaking, one of the more successful in the late 20th century. Characterized by some continuity, but the Concertation regained legitimacy, won the next elections in 1989, and civilian rule returned in 1990.
Though that 1989 election was still tough.
Very contested. Pro-Pinochet forces used tactics like contra-auditing, maybe trying to challenge results, and even military intimidation campaigns. The Concertation pushed back with reforms for fair access and mobilization.
And civil society played a big role during this time.
Remarkably so. Despite all the repression, independent citizen groups emerged civil society. They weren't just about politics. They had a broader agenda for justice and rights and managed to put real constraints on state power. Really resilient.
And then Pinochet gets arrested in London in '98. That must have sent shockwaves.
Huge shock on a Spanish judge's order. For some in Chile, it felt like justice finally catching up. For others, it brought back all that fear from the transition, showed how deep the divisions still were.
Okay, moving into the 21st century. Chile gets this reputation for economic success.
It does. Widely seen as a model case of reform from the mid-'80s, '90s onwards. High growth, poverty dropped, social indicators improved, sound finances, low inflation, stable exchange rate, good policies, good macroeconomic management, boosted productivity.
But we talked about a paradox.
The crucial paradox. Economic success, yes, but alongside deep social tensions. Those neoliberal policies under Pinochet, The sources note they initially caused depression, high unemployment due to all the privatization, utilities, banks, everything.
And the benefits weren't shared equally.
Not at all. The sources point fingers squarely at the Santiago elite. They benefited massively from connections, from those privatization deals. Their income soared compared to average Chileans.
And that inequality seems to be the powder keg for the massive protests in October 2019.
Exactly. An extraordinary explosion. Started with students protesting a small subway fare hike, but it tapped into something much deeper. Spread nationwide, all ages, daily protests, riots, and national strike. One source used the phrase "the scum rose," capturing that raw anger.
So it wasn't just the fare.
Absolutely not. That was just the trigger. The roots were the high cost of living, fueled by that persistent inequality, and frustration with the quality and access to basic services like health and education.
And these protests challenged the whole system.
Fundamentally, they questioned the entire neoliberal model established under the dictatorship, led to demands for a new constitution, drafted by a constituent assembly. It really exposed the gap between Chile's image and the lived reality for many.
And connected back to the memory of the dictatorship.
Very much so. The sources say these movements created a new public memory discourse, one demanding a break from the dictatorship model, demanding a new shape of justice, highlighting how today's institutions are rooted in that repressive past.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about Chile's culture. It sounds incredibly varied.
It's a real mosaic. Going way back, you had Andean peoples making amazing ceramics, textiles, the Mapuche, the Aymara principal cultures, strong social structures, often based on collective land use.
Then the Spanish arrived.
Bringing European influences, of course. Craft-based painting, sculpture, architecture, literature, arts, all layered on top.
And the 19th, early 20th century saw more local developments.
Yeah. European styles continued, especially in Santiago, but uniquely Chilean things emerged too, like picadas, these social eating and drinking spots, a whole culture around them.
Theaters too, Vasco's.
Right, theaters for a more educated crowd. And publishing grew lithography, caricature. It was an artistic awakening, including the Modernismo literary movement.
What about music? How did that evolve?
A long blend. Indigenous rhythms met European styles from the late 18th century. Sources mention pieces like La Silva, showing French dance influence.
And popular music.
Things like European couplets, Spanish theater songs, they all fed into creating the tonada.
The tonada.
Described as a new Latin American song style that really caught on across society. Plus classical music, brass bands, opera, then gramophones, radio, tango icons like Gardel, a really rich mix.
And food. Chilean cuisine must be a blend too.
Definitely. Big influence from Spain, especially Inquisition-era Spain, bringing techniques and ingredients, but also hints of Africa, the Middle East, Asia over time.
What about the indigenous base?
That's the foundation. Mapuche food using local produce, seafood, what was available.
And the Spanish brought.
Key techniques, plowing, roasting, grilling, stewing, deep frying. And ingredients, beef, pork, olive oil, onions, rice, wheat, transformed the diet.
Did it change much after independence?
New influences came in. And interestingly, in the 19th and early 20th century, the working and middle classes really embraced local rural foods, forging a stronger Chilean culinary identity.
Then modernization changed things again.
Yeah, urbanization led to more mixing, incorporating foreign techniques. But things like canning and preserving old rural skills actually gained more respect.
And festivals must reflect this mix too.
They absolutely do. The annual cycle of festivals connects to beliefs about time, space, community. New Year's is a good example, reflection, looking ahead, often blending pre-Christian beliefs with Catholic traditions.
Any specific examples?
The sources mention the Mapuche New Year Puruwin, or Puruwinyu, in places like Chiloé, tied right into the agricultural cycle, end of the old year, start of the new planting season, with specific rituals like passing fire, traditional games.
Okay, finally, let's touch on foreign relations. Generally seen as productive, but with challenges.
That seems fair. Relations with the U.S., for instance, were definitely strained in the 60s, with U.S. attempts to stop Allende. Chilean diplomacy often supported reform movements elsewhere in the region.
And U.S. meddling tended to backfire.
Yeah, the sources suggest it often united Chilean leftists and nationalists against interference.
Allende's own foreign policy sounds quite independent.
Very active. He kept ties with the U.S. and France, but also built strong relations with the USSR, Cuba, Eastern Europe. Productive ties with China, too.
But clashed with some allies.
Yeah, clashes with some Western allies and within the UN. His focus was diversification markets, trade routes, building solidarity with Latin America and the developing world, calling for third world cooperation.
But maybe not challenging the global economic order enough.
The sources hint his approach there might have been a bit passive, leading to some difficulties.
After the War of the Pacific, relations with Peru and Bolivia obviously remained tricky.
Very tricky. Chile was worried they might team up to get lost territory back. There was peace, but it felt fragile. Trouble was expected.
How did they manage that diplomatically?
Difficult negotiations. Sending envoys to Lima. Dealing with border issues, refugees from past Bolivian governments. Chile actually let them go voluntarily. Bolivia trying hard not to cede territory. Chile pushing its legal case.
Were there concrete outcomes from those talks?
Yeah, things like reducing the size of the Antofagasta region in arbitration, setting compensation for Peru, like Chile building a new capital for displaced people, granting road and rail access. Complex stuff.
Did Chile join international organizations?
Yes, League of Nations, Organization of American States, generally looked for regional, multilateral solutions.
But its diplomatic style was maybe different from others.
The sources suggest that. Unlike maybe Mexico or Argentina focusing on big moral causes, Chile's history of conflict with neighbors made its diplomacy often more focused on nationalism, immediate interests, rather than relying purely on international law for the future.
And Chile was a pioneer in sea law.
Yeah, liberalizing policies on sovereign seas, trying to make treaties about things like river access with Peru, ahead of the curve there.
Wow. We have covered a phenomenal amount of ground, from the Andes to Allende to modern protests.
It's an incredible story, and looking back, the sources really stress that in the decades since the dictatorship ended, Chile has achieved things of inestimable value.
Certainly that global reputation for economic stability.
Right, and Chileans today enjoy a wide range of rights, civil, social. The sources even suggest that in some ways, services like education, health, infrastructure are better than in some richer countries.
Kind of an ironic consequence of the dictatorship making some things more widely available.
That's the phrase used, yeah. An unintended outcome, perhaps?
So definite progress in prosperity and rights.
Undeniable progress, and yet here's the final challenge the sources leave us with. Despite all that, the generations who grew up after the dictatorship haven't quite managed to build a society or institutions where everyone feels they truly belong, truly participate, and everyone plays by the same rules.
Which leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it?
It really does. When you take Chile's whole story, that isolating geography, the cultural richness, the violence, the booms and busts, that transition from dictatorship to a democracy still wrestling with inequality and tension, what does it tell you, the listener, about that constant struggle? The struggle to balance stability, achieve real justice, and make sure everyone truly has a stake in their nation's future.
Something really important to think about as you reflect on this deep dive into Chile's long and complicated history